My sister cut me out of the estate and said, "You weren't there for Dad." So I uncovered the emails proving she'd forced him to change his will and took her to court. I never thought I'd end up sitting in a courtroom, of all places, glaring across the aisle at my little sister. Sophie, the same kid who used to sneak into my room for sleepovers because she was scared of thunderstorms. The girl I used to braid hair for before school every morning, who I'd practically raised after our mom died. Now here she was, dressed in a crisp, somber black suit, staring straight ahead and pretending I didn't exist. It's funny how life can twist everything around. So how did we get here? It started the year my dad's health took a nosedive. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly. He'd always been a bit stubborn about not bothering us with his problems. But it was clear he couldn't manage on his own, and since I was across the country in Portland, it was Sophie who stepped in to help him out. "I'll keep an eye on him," she'd told me one night on the phone, just as casually as if we were talking about taking care of a stray cat. "He's fine, Anna. You don't need to worry." "Are you sure? I mean, I can fly out." "Seriously, don't waste your money," she'd insisted, her tone almost irritated. "It's not like he's dying. Just aging. Relax." I'd taken her word for it. I had my own plate full, a job in tech that paid well but demanded long hours, and a young son, Max, who needed a stable home. And I'd learned over the years that when Sophie took on a role, she liked to control it. She was the type to organize bake sales like they were military operations, just to avoid anyone messing things up. So, I let her handle Dad. But over time, the phone calls to Dad started feeling off. He sounded tired, irritable, like he was talking to me through a thick, invisible wall. Sometimes he'd forget basic things, like Max's age or where I lived. "Dad, are you okay?" I'd ask, trying to sound casual. "Course I am, Anna. Just tired. Sophie's here. Don't worry." Sophie was always here, wasn't she? Every time I tried to bring up visiting or offer to help with his medical appointments, I'd get a dismissive wave from him or a quick text from her, "We're all good. No need to disrupt your life." The last time I saw him alive was during Thanksgiving. I dragged Max with me to Minnesota, determined to see for myself how Dad was doing. Sophie had reluctantly invited us to stay at her house. She always had some excuse for why it was inconvenient, but I'd insisted. When we arrived, Sophie was her usual polished self. She greeted me with a tight-lipped smile that barely hid her annoyance. "Anna, good to see you. I wasn't sure you'd actually make it this time," she said, barely glancing at Max. "Of course, I made it. He's our dad, Sophie." I looked around. The house was spotless as usual, the kind of place where you couldn't imagine a single speck of dust daring to land on the furniture. "Right," she said, crossing her arms. "Well, we've got everything pretty well taken care of, but it's nice you could drop by." Drop by? Like I was some distant relative popping in for the weekend. When we finally visited Dad, I realized how bad things had gotten. He was thinner, his clothes hung off him like they'd been bought for someone else. His eyes were dull, and he kept drifting off mid-sentence. Sophie hovered around him, answering questions for him before he had a chance to even open his mouth. "Dad, how have you been?" I asked, trying to ignore her looming presence. "Oh, same old. Sophie's keeping me on a strict diet," he chuckled weakly, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Just fatigue. Nothing with flavor, of course." "Dad, it's not a joke," Sophie said sharply. "We're following the doctor's orders, and if it's up to me, you're not ending up in the hospital over a cheeseburger." He tried to laugh again, but it turned into a wheezing cough. I looked at Sophie, my concern barely hidden. "Are you sure this is good for him?" I asked. Sophie rolled her eyes, as if I'd just questioned her about some trivial detail. "Anna, I know you mean well, but you don't get it. This is what he needs. Trust me, I'm the one here every day." "I see what you don't." There it was. Her little reminder slipped into the conversation with a sugary edge. I bit my tongue and forced myself to smile, knowing an argument wouldn't help Dad. A few months later, Dad passed away. I got the call from Sophie early in the morning. I barely heard her words, everything was a blur. My dad, the man who'd raised us alone after our mom died, was gone. I flew out to Minnesota immediately, numb with grief, only to find Sophie had taken charge of everything. The funeral arrangements, the wake, even the guest list. When I tried to suggest something, choosing a particular hymn or arranging flowers, she dismissed it. "Look, I've got it handled, Anna. I'm sure your ideas are nice, but I know what Dad would want." "What Dad would want?" I repeated, anger bubbling up. "Sophie, he was my dad too." She let out an exaggerated sigh, one that said I've had enough of this. "Exactly. He was your dad too, but you were never around to know what he wanted." Her words stung, cutting deep. I knew I hadn't been as present as she had, but this was cruel. Still, I didn't argue. I swallowed my pride and went through the motions of the funeral, feeling like an outsider in my own family. Then, a few weeks after Dad's death, I got a letter from Sophie's lawyer. I opened it with a shaky hand, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Apparently, Dad had revised his will shortly before he died, leaving everything to Sophie, his house, his savings, even his sentimental belongings. I was stunned. I called her that night, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Sophie, what's going on? I just got this letter about Dad's will." "Oh, that?" Her tone was casual, almost bored. "Yeah, Dad changed his will last year. He felt it was fairer this way." "Fairer? He left me nothing, Sophie." "Nothing." I could feel my voice rising, but I didn't care. "Well, you have a job, Anna. A good one. You didn't need his money, and honestly, I was the one here, taking care of him day in and day out. It makes sense. It makes sense to you because you manipulated him into it." The accusation spilled out before I could stop it. There was silence on her end, and then she laughed, low and cold. "Manipulated him? Anna, please. You don't get it, do you? You left him. You barely called, barely visited. He was practically a stranger to you by the end." "That's not true," I whispered, feeling something break inside. "You don't know anything about my relationship with him." "I know more than you ever did," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Face it, Anna. You weren't there when it mattered. You have no right to anything he left behind." I spent days spiraling, feeling lost, betrayed. I'd tried to do the right thing, to balance my life with my responsibilities to Dad, but here I was, left with nothing, while Sophie, who'd always controlled everything, had taken the last piece of him. I could barely eat, barely think. I replayed our conversations, trying to find some sense of justice in all of it, but there was none. And I couldn't let it go. I hired a lawyer. Part of me was terrified. I didn't want to destroy whatever shred of family I had left. But Dad deserved better than this. I started combing through old emails, messages, anything that could prove she'd manipulated him into changing his will. And then, we found it. Hidden in a series of emails to Dad's lawyer were messages from Sophie, where she'd practically demanded that he update his will. She'd called me negligent, said I never cared, painted herself as the only one who'd been there for Dad. She'd twisted every detail, making it sound like I was some absentee daughter who'd abandoned him. When I read those words, I felt like I'd been punched. I'd never known such betrayal, such calculated cruelty. But those emails were exactly what we needed. I confronted Sophie before the trial. "Sophie," I said, cornering her in the hallway of the courthouse. "Why did you do it? Why couldn't you just let him divide things equally?" She didn't even flinch. "Because, Anna, I deserved it. I earned it. You were off living your life, and I was the one here, handling everything." "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I was there in every way I could be. You took advantage of him when he was vulnerable. You lied to him about me." "Maybe I did," she admitted, her face blank. "But at least I was there." The trial didn't last long after that. The judge read the emails and saw her for who she really was. He ruled in my favor, and Dad's estate was divided equally between us, just as he'd originally wanted. When it was all over, I watched her walk out of the courthouse, her face stony, her shoulders tense. She didn't look back. In that moment, I realized our relationship was truly over. Whatever bond we'd once had, it was gone. Months have passed, and I still think about her sometimes, about what she did and what we lost. But I've also found peace. I know now that I did the right thing, that I stood up for myself and for Dad's memory. And while Sophie may never understand that, I've finally come to terms with it. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the inheritance. It was about honoring Dad's legacy, about standing up for what was right. And that's something Sophie will never be able to take from me. After the ruling, I thought I'd feel relieved, like a massive weight would finally be lifted off my shoulders. But as satisfying as the victory was, it left something hollow in me, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. Sophie and I hadn't spoken since that day outside the courtroom. She'd walked out of my life just as I'd feared, but instead of sadness, a quiet sense of resolve settled over me. This was far from over. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. The news of the court case had spread through our small town in Minnesota. People started talking, friends of our parents, family friends, even some of Sophie's neighbors and her husband's relatives. As more details leaked, people started questioning Sophie's character, wondering how she could have done something so heartless. She'd always maintained this image of being the perfect daughter, the dutiful caretaker who did what nobody else would. But now that facade was cracking, and there was nothing she could do to patch it up. One evening, about a month after the ruling, I got a call from an old family friend, Mrs. Green. She'd been close to our mom and had practically watched us grow up. "Anna, I hope you don't mind me calling like this," she started, her voice warm but edged with concern. "I just wanted you to know. People have been talking about what happened with your sister." I let out a sigh, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know. It's been a lot to deal with." "Well," she continued, her tone turning almost conspiratorial, "I thought you should know that Sophie's been putting her house up for sale. Adam left her, and the neighbors say she's barely been seen around. People don't trust her the same way anymore. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and pity hearing this. Part of me wanted to gloat, she'd brought this on herself. But there was also a deep sadness. She'd chosen this path, pushed her family away, and ruined her own life in the process. Thanks for letting me know, Mrs. Green, I replied softly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, dear. Just remember, you did what you had to. Your father would be proud of you. Her words hit me with a force I hadn't expected. After everything, I hadn't really thought about whether Dad would be proud of my actions, only that I was doing what was right. But hearing her say that made me feel like I'd honored him in the only way I could. I thanked Mrs. Green and hung up, feeling more at peace than I had in a long time. A few months later, as life settled back to normal, I received an unexpected call from Sophie's husband, Adam. We'd barely spoken throughout the ordeal, but he'd been there in the courtroom, sitting beside Sophie with a face as stony as hers. Adam? I answered, surprised. This is unexpected. I know, and I apologize for calling out of the blue, he replied, his voice strained but polite. I wanted to explain a few things, if you'll allow me. I hesitated, unsure what to expect, but curiosity got the better of me. All right. Go ahead. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. Anna, I had no idea what Sophie was planning with your dad. She kept me in the dark about the will and everything leading up to it. When the truth came out, I felt betrayed. Just like you did. I could hear the frustration in his voice, the hurt. It reminded me that I wasn't the only one Sophie had deceived. I'm sorry, Adam, I said, and I meant it. I didn't want things to end this way. Neither did I, but I couldn't stay married to someone who'd manipulate her own family like that. Who knows what else she's hidden from me. He let out a weary sigh. Anyway, I thought you should know. She's not doing well. She's lost a lot of friends, her job. I think she finally understands what she did. A flicker of satisfaction lit up inside me, but I kept it to myself. Instead, I just said, thank you for telling me, Adam. I appreciate it. After a brief pause, he spoke again, this time with a hint of guilt in his voice. And, Anna. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. I should have stood up to her in court. I was just so wrapped up in keeping the peace that I didn't realize what that peace was costing us all. No hard feelings, Adam, I replied honestly. We all made mistakes. With that, we ended the call, and I felt like another piece of this chapter had finally come to a close. A few weeks later, the ultimate twist of fate unfolded. I received a letter from Sophie. It was a thick envelope, worn and crumpled, as if she'd written and rewritten it countless times before finally sending it. The letter started with a few tentative apologies, hollow words trying to fill a gaping wound. But then, as I read further, her tone changed, shifting from guarded regret to raw honesty. She wrote about how she'd resented me for leaving, for moving across the country and building a life while she was stuck taking care of Dad. I didn't realize how lonely I was, she admitted, her handwriting shaky. I put so much of myself into taking care of him that I started feeling entitled to his love, his money, his everything. And by the time I realized what I was doing, I was too far gone to stop. She confessed to things I hadn't known, times she'd guilt-tripped Dad, even lied to him to keep me out of the picture. She admitted to hiding some of his letters to me, even telling him I was too busy to talk when he wanted to call. It was a horrifying, sickening realization, but reading her words, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pity. At the end, she begged for forgiveness. She didn't expect me to forget or pretend everything was okay, but she needed to say it. Her last words echoed in my mind long after I finished reading. I know it's too late to be sisters again. I know I've destroyed any chance of that. But please, Anna. Just know I'm sorry. If there's any way I can make this right, let me know. I let her letter sit on my desk for days, unsure how I felt. The anger had faded, replaced by something gentler, more reflective. Maybe, in the end, we were both victims of circumstance. She'd made terrible choices, yes, but maybe this letter was her first real step toward redemption. I decided to write back. My letter was short, but it said everything I needed to say. I told her I forgave her, but I didn't invite her back into my life. Trust, I explained, was something that took years to build and only moments to shatter. I wished her well and hoped she'd find a way to heal from this and grow. As I sealed the envelope, a sense of closure settled over me. Sophie had faced the consequences of her actions, and now, I could finally move on, free of resentment. She'd never be the sister I'd hoped for, but that was okay. Life had a way of rewriting itself, and I was ready to write my own story, one where I could remember Dad without bitterness or regret. In the end, I came out stronger, with a clearer sense of who I was and what mattered to me. And while Sophie's path would likely never cross mine again, I knew she'd been left to reckon with the truth. For me, that was enough. I had won back my family's legacy, my integrity, and most of all, my peace.